So, not too long ago we met Louise, the valiant ecologist who has the misfortune of being French and lost in an Antarctic valley basin as the protagonist of
Lichen or Lichen.
yeah, whatever, man. The survival adventure blockbuster I'm currently cobbling together. You might remember Louise being very proud of all the elaborate stunts she had learned and how eager she was to show them off. If you don't know, here's what her demonstration looked like. Louise, as of now, can run around faster, sneak, crawl, dash, slip, jump, climb on stuff, climb up stuff, climb down stuff, climb along stuff, hurt herself falling off stuff, hit stuff, go even faster, and use a tablet computer. In this video we will focus on how the base movement is implemented and interconnected. This includes most of what you just saw, along with some additional details not specifically mentioned, but not climbing, because that's a whole new can of worms. After we're done with that, we'll look back on what has been achieved within the last 2 months and laugh at how little it is. Sounds good? No? Alright, here we go. At the root of everything is a character class called Acting Pawn, which is the base class for all pawns that have some kind of agency, so basically the player and enemies. It houses a bunch of functions and variables both player and enemy share for mainly combat, so the only relevant thing for movement is gameplay tags. Gameplay tags are neat because they are much easier to keep track of than tons of bools. This leads us to the player pawn class. Here the camera control input is set up and also the input values for WASD and mouse are saved. We are also keeping track of whether we are currently accelerating or not. Within this class is also the heart of the character movement, which is this function, an enum-based state machine that converts gameplay tags into a switch statement. Well, mainly. It runs on top of the built-in character movement modes because I didn't feel like getting into writing my own movement modes in C++ just to switch up a bunch of values. So I'm calling these variations on movement modes movement states. Movement states are updated every time movement mode is updated or whenever the state needs to manually change. This is done by checking for any gameplay tags within the movement text container and setting the enum value accordingly. If there are no tags applied, it defaults to one of the base movement modes. A downside to this approach is that there can only be one movement tag applied at any given time, because the switch statement can only look for exact matches, which makes it susceptible to scripting errors. So why go through the trouble of doing this? Well, as with every good rule set, there are some exceptions which would make the system very clunky otherwise. The hottest contender for jank would be the falling mode, which occurs very often and is not associated with any states. As for that, tagging for falling each and every time would introduce a ton of ifs to the entire movement code. So before even going for tags, we are checking if the character is falling. On top of that, cancelling the dashing state is dependent on entering the falling state. It's technically a redundancy, but it won't work properly without it. Contender number 2 is an input log for when the character is, for example, ragdolling. Could be done with just a tag as well, but other tags did easily interfere. The movement log is set directly as an enum value to bypass the entire determination process unless the force update option is checked. There is also a force state option, which lets us choose the new movement state manually. Going in, the current movement state is saved and put out along with the new one for a movement state changed event analogous to the movement mode changed one on the character movement component. Alright, with the groundwork endured, we can now actually look at stuff wiggling. Welcome to Louise's personal blueprint, ignore the mess. Let's start out with the regular ground movement because there's not much to it. Here you can see the switch statement of the movement state machine. When we are inputting movement while in the walking state, we are first running the slowdown uphill function and then add movement via the regular scale values. The slowdown uphill function gets the dot product between up vector and ground to determine whether we are moving on a slope. If the slope is steep enough, an opposite force scaled by the dot product is applied to the character movement. This will make us gradually slower when moving up slopes. But if we are going up a slope, why? On tick, a function is lerping between a minimum and a maximum walkable slope angle based on current speed. Once we are slowed down enough, the slope is no longer walkable and we'll fall down. This fully applies to sprinting as well. Kinda like Super Mario 64, just with more death. Sprinting is essentially the same as walking, just with higher maximum speed. Here we are basically just defaulting from other movement states, so we can just start sprinting without having to manually uncrouch or something. The other start and stop checks are for combat, so we'll get to them sometime else. Pretty similar with sneaking and crouching as well. Tapping C will let us sneak, which slows us down and makes us a little bit smaller. Holding C from either regular movement or sneaking will let us crawl, and tapping C from crawling will let us snap back to regular movement. This is to allow for a fast transition into running away. The same principle is applied when jumping from crawling. First default from crawling, wait for the animation to finish, then jump. Jumping is surprisingly not completely straightforward at all, because there are several things to take into account. First one, gravity. Unreal uses a static 1.75 gravity scale by default, which makes jumping feel super floaty. To correct this, gravity is set to 1.75 on jump input and then set to 3 after 12 reference frames. The result is a nice responsive jump which does not feel floaty. Similarly, upon falling off a ledge, 0.2 seconds of coyote time are triggered, during which the gravity is lowered and jump velocity is increased to counteract some of the negative C velocity, thus keeping a coyote jump relatively consistent with a regular jump. Both of them default to normal either after coyote time ends, we have landed, or a ledge was grabbed. Last but not least, a sphere trace is activated that adds some upwards velocity in case we barely caught a ledge. Not actually though. The jump is also buffered, so the input doesn't get eaten if we press jump shortly before landing. This is done via a macro that saves the input as a bool for 6 reference frames, and if we land within those 6 reference frames, we will jump upon landing. Yes, and there's also a range for jump height by how long the button is pressed. Jumping's close sibling is falling, right? Because in most cases, when we are not on the ground, we are falling. This may happen from pretty much any state, so as we discussed earlier, to reliably trigger the falling state, we have to ignore all state tags when updating the movement state to falling. If we are falling, we are doing 2 things. For one, as we discussed earlier as well, terminating the dashing state by removing the tag, and then we trigger a loop that checks how far we have been falling. This loop works as follows. We first check if our C velocity is less than 0. If it is, we are going down. Saving our highest point, then we keep checking if we are still falling, and once we exceed a certain distance, given we are still falling, we get a hard falling tag and default from sneaking or sprinting. The threshold is different for when we are sliding, because otherwise we take damage in certain scenarios we don't want to take damage in. Once the movement mode changes back to walking, we check for the hard landing tag and then ouch! Note that this check is done on movement mode changed and not on landed. This is because both events work slightly differently and on landed is not 100% reliable. So, we landed, the hard falling tag is there, we get our movement locked, the tag is removed and fall damage is applied. Now here's a cool thing. If we land on a steep enough slope, we'll start sliding down. If not, we ragdoll, which I'll get into some other time when we are talking interaction. Sliding, I hear you ask. Yes, there's sliding, which is triggered by either hard falling onto or ending a dash on a slope. Which leads me to a thing I forgot to mention. When ragdolling, orient rotation to movement must be unchecked, or else the ragdolling character will spin around even with locked movement. After ragdolling, we default back and update movement state. We do the same thing when entering a slide from a fall for, well, obvious reasons. After that, slide movement parameters are set, the tag is applied and movement state gets updated. This works the other way around if the tag is already in place and we are not choosing to ignore it. Why ignore it? Because we are stopping the sliding state on jump or fall, but we want it to continue when landing. This is also why the fall damage threshold is much higher when sliding. So, sliding is based on adding force because regular movement input doesn't feel slidey at all, no matter how you tweak it. To incorporate the slope into the slide direction without using physics, we basically calculate a mixture of the control rotation and the direction down the slope. Nothing hard. Notice that we are still adding a bit of movement input. This is purely to keep the movement orientation functional and works much better than setting actor rotation on tick. With force-based movement comes the challenge of not having capped speed. To counteract that, we keep checking our speed and set it to a cap value once the threshold is exceeded. If the speed is lower than the cap and we are not inputting any force, we will add some force down the slope to simulate natural slippiness. This is followed by checking if we should keep sliding, which is not the case if we are slower than 400 units or the slope is not steep enough anymore. We are checking twice though, because a slight delay in moving left or right from forward, for example, would have been enough to kill the slide. So if we are still not inputting anything after the stop criteria have been met, we continue sliding. If the stop conditions are met, we stop checking and after a short delay, which is based on our speed at the time of stop criteria, we stop sliding in fall. And finally, dashing, dodging, fast hop, easy. Not entirely. First we check if a lock parameter actually lets us. This is in place to prevent spamming. Then we check for coyote time, which also lets us dash if we have started falling. Dashing will also kill the sneak state to allow for running away quickly, similar to how jumping interacts with sneaking and crawling. Iframes are applied, collision is changed on enemies so we don't get brickwalled by them, and then the actual dash happens by just setting a velocity for one frame. If orientation is always rotated to movement, just multiplying the actor forward vector by the desired value would be sufficient. Since our combat movement is strafing though, I didn't mention that, didn't I? We need to calculate the character direction instead, so it works along strafe directions as well. So while setting velocity kinda makes the dash framerate dependent, it doesn't trigger the falling state like the launch character node does, and we wouldn't want that. After the velocity is set, we are doing some camera trickery and then we are unlocking a new dash after 45 reference frames. The dash is set up with coyote time and fall state like that in general because this way we are not allowed to dash after jumping, but we can jump at any point during the dash. It's also slightly dynamic based on our movement speed at the start of the dash, essentially creating a possibly risky long jump we can clear massive gaps with. Still there? Wow. So, I basically walked you through several months of work at this point. I'm pretty happy with how the movement feels. It's also free of very easy to trigger bugs, at least I hope so. This might be a long time for something not freakishly complex, but learning takes time and refining noob code does as well. Because things take so much time, I have been trying out some art style shenanigans to end up with a compelling look that is easily maintainable for the past 2 months. I tried various kinds of cell shaders, even going full untitled goose game at one point, procedural shapes for details. Louise's face and hair, for example, are almost purely done with vertex colors and UV distortion, and so on. I have settled on this digital art kinda look for now, which includes an outline mask and flattening of lightning vectors instead of cell shading. Since I'm not particularly fond of cell shading in general, it's not much of a compromise. I do think it looks pretty cool though. Another thing I got done, well, almost because the main animation is still missing, is climbing walls. The last major mechanic outside of combat. Combat will be finished off within this year, and since everything else is pretty much ready, I can go on and start making the actual game next year. Feels good. I intend to make a demo dungeon for playtesting sometime along the line, so look forward to that. And I also curated and made some landscape assets to line out the vistas, and I also fixed the mountain range and distance fog, which also looks pretty good now. There has been some dabbling in PCG, but I kinda blew it up and didn't get around to fixing it yet, so maybe next time. And that's that, I guess. Feel free to slap those bad practices right in my face, ask about everything I was too ineloquent to express in a sane manner. Go therefore and work.